Okay, let's unpack this. Could everything we believe about how society works, our laws, our art, even our morals, could it all be shaped by something as, well, basic as how we make a living? Karl Marx certainly thought so. And today, we're taking a deep dive into historical materialism. It's really the absolute cornerstone of his social theory.
It really is.
Our mission today, then, is to try and uncover what really drives societal change. Maybe beyond just the big ideas or what powerful leaders decide.
And what's fascinating here, I think, is that Marx offers this radically different lens, doesn't he?
Totally.
He argues that to understand how society develops through history, we have to look at its material conditions.
Material conditions.
Like specifically how people produce and reproduce the necessities of life. Food, shelter, everything.
Right.
So unlike idealist theories, the ones that claim ideas shape history, Marx kind of flips that script entirely.
Flipped it how?
He says the economic structures, they fundamentally determine our social relationships, our political institutions, even our cultural life.
Wow. And he makes a pretty bold claim right there in the Communist Manifesto, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah.
The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. I mean, that's a huge statement.
It is. And historical materialism really sees history as this dynamic process, right? Driven by changes in the fundamental material base of society.
Okay, so the material base, what's in that?
Well, it's everything from the tools we use, the technology, the labor we perform, the resources we access, and crucially, the relations between social classes in that production.
Got it.
Societies in this view, they evolve through these distinct modes of production.
So it's not just about what we think or what leaders decree, but literally how we produce stuff and organize ourselves to survive.
Exactly.
Which brings us to that famous model of his, the base and superstructure. Can you kind of walk us through that?
Absolutely. So think of society like a building, right?
Okay.
The economic base or infrastructure, that's a foundation. It's got two key parts, the forces of production.
The tools, the tech, the people working.
Right. Your technology, labor power, resources. And then you have the relations of production.
Which is like who owns the factory versus who works in it.
Precisely. Who owns the means of production and how people relate to each other in that whole process.
Okay, so that's the base, the foundation, what's built on top.
That's the superstructure. And it includes pretty much everything else. Our political institutions, legal systems, ideologies, art, religion, philosophy.
Wow, so everything else.
According to Marx, yes. And crucially, these things aren't independent. They arise from, and importantly, they reinforce the economic base.
So it's not just that capitalism gives us factories.
Right. Marx would argue it also shapes our ideas about, say, individual freedom or our legal system protecting private property, even how we view family, all ultimately to serve that economic base. It's a bit mind-bending when you think about it.
It really is. So if the economy is the engine, what happens when that engine starts to, seize up? When the old parts can't keep up?
Well, that's where Marx gets really interesting. He suggests that when the forces of production, say, new technology, new ways of working, come into conflict with the existing relations of production.
Like the old ownership system. Feudal lords holding back factories, maybe?
Exactly that kind of thing.
Yeah.
When the old relations no longer serve or even hinder the new productive forces, that's when Marx says revolutionary periods emerge.
Okay, so conflict drives change.
Precisely. The old relations become essentially fetters on the new forces. Marx saw history as this progression, driven by these inherent contradictions. Each system, he argued, contained the seeds of its own destruction.
Like feudalism's contradictions leading to capitalism.
You got it. And at the heart of these big shifts, class struggle.
Slaves versus masters, serfs versus lords.
Workers versus capitalists, in his analysis. Social transformation happens through this conflict. The dominant class, they use the superstructure laws, culture, ideas to keep their power. Revolution, for Marx, happens when the oppressed class becomes conscious of its situation and, organizes to overthrow the existing order.
And this whole idea is grounded in something called dialectical materialism.
Yeah, briefly, that's the philosophical underpinning. It's the idea that change comes from internal contradictions, like a struggle of opposing forces within a system driving it forward.
Which really goes against those idealist theories, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Instead of history being pulled along by great ideas or, divine will, Marx famously says, social being determines consciousness.
Meaning our material life shapes our ideas, not the other way around.
That's the core of it. But, this raises an important question. What about the criticisms? It sounds very neat, maybe too neat.
Right. Does it really explain everything?
Exactly. And historical materialism has faced, significant critiques over the years. Some argue it's too deterministic.
Like reducing everything just to economics.
Yeah. Or maybe neglecting things like culture, gender, race as forces in their own right. And later Marxists, people like Gramsci or Althusser, they actually tried to expand the theory.
How so?
They brought in a more nuanced role for ideology, for the state, acknowledging it's maybe a more complex interaction between the base and superstructure than Marx initially laid out.
Interesting. So it's been debated and developed.
Definitely. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, historical materialism isn't just like a theory about the past. It's offered as a powerful method for social analysis today.
How so?
It encourages you to look beneath the surface, right? To try and unveil the deep economic structures and interests that might be driving political events or cultural shifts, things we see all around us.
Okay, so what does this all mean for you, listening right now? I suppose understanding this idea of a material structure might help us grasp why things are the way they are, and maybe, potentially, how they could be changed. And here's a thought to leave you with. If every system, as Marx suggests, contains the seeds of its own destruction, what might that imply about the systems we live in today?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah. How does understanding the base change how you view the superstructure around you, from your job to the news you read?
Lots to think about there.
Definitely. Next time, we'll dive into how Marx and Engels took these powerful, sometimes controversial insights and distilled them into their most famous call to action, the Communist Manifesto.